Recording in progress.
So I think I think maybe we'll get going. Is that okay, Anahita?
Yep, that sounds great.
All right, terrific. Good morning, everybody, and thank you all for coming. I'm Eric Schwartz. I'm president of Refugees International, and I'm here with Horton Lang, our vice president for policy and programs, Yael Shaker, our senior U.S. advocate, Daphne Paniotatos, our advocate for Europe, our senior fellow, Sarah Miller, and members of our communications team as well. And I hope I haven't left anyone out. After the president made his announcement about a withdrawal from Afghanistan in April, when he made the announcement in April, we at Refugees International had a sense of the humanitarian challenges this would bring. And we began to work on a report to focus on the broadest range of issues: the humanitarian situation within Afghanistan, the responses to the likely humanitarian crisis by governments in the region, the asylum and resettlement challenges in the United States and other resettlement countries and countries of asylum. And maybe tragically, many of our concerns and planning made sense in terms of what has evolved. So this comprehensive 8,700 word report is a result of those efforts. And I'll repeat what we said in the press release. The well-being and the rights of hundreds of thousands of Afghans are at stake. The United States has both the capacity and the obligation to act in many different ways. And this detailed and carefully researched report charts a way forward. But essentially, as comprehensive and as extensive as it is, it really can be broken down into 10 sets of recommendations. We recommend, one, that the president should appoint a special envoy for Afghanistan, that the administration must press for safe passage for Afghans who must flee. 3, the United States should provide a pathway to permanent status for Afghans who arrive. 4, the president should announce a refugee admission ceiling of 200,000 for 2022 to send a strong message to countries that are being asked to provide protection and safety and refuge for Afghan refugees. The administration must promote Afghan American leadership in the response. Number 6, the US should provide at least $5 billion in direct additional funding to civilian agencies of government to address the special needs of Afghans. Number 7, the Secretary General should appoint a UN envoy, and the Security Council should modify the UN presence in Afghanistan to respond to the situation on the ground. Number 8, donors should support regional countries that are going to host Afghans. Number 9, neighboring governments, Pakistan in particular, but other governments, should provide both refuge and access to services for Afghans. And finally, the European Union and EU member states must welcome Afghans. So that's all in the report, but sometimes repetition is not the worst thing in the world. And now I want to turn to Horton Lang, who wrote much of this report, but also importantly, coordinated and led the team in the overall production of this document. So Horton, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Eric. And just to underscore, though, this was a team effort by sort of everyone involved in Refugees International, and it was really great to see how everything came together. Personally, just by way of background, I spent a couple of years in Afghanistan, I think like many people and journalists and stuff on this call, with the UN mission a while ago. And so this is something that, obviously sort of not only professionally for our organization is quite important, but personally means a great deal. We started sort of getting concerned about the humanitarian implications of US policy back in April when some of the initial announcements were made on the timeline for withdrawal, and sort of looking at the problem and wondering how that was going to play out in the time frame available. And then in June, we started doing some more writing as we started watching what was happening in the countryside, saying, look, we think we see the beginnings of a significant sort of displacement and humanitarian crisis taking shape, and we need to start putting the planning into place now for this. So obviously then, the events of late July and early August unfold, and, some folks had this as worst case scenarios, but it was really, really hard to see some of this stuff coming in any event, at least at the speed and pace that it did. So I think like a lot of organizations, analysts and humanitarians, we had our sort of heads down, really focusing on what was occurring around the airlift. But during that time, in addition to the work we were doing around the airlift, we thought we really need to put down a frame for what the policy framework, not just for the United States, but other countries, needs to look like, so that the kind of chaos that has enveloped the effort around the airport doesn't come to characterize the future international response to what is going to be a crisis of significant regional proportions, we believe, in the coming months and years. So we broke it into three theaters, right? One is like Afghanistan and the region, so the neighboring countries, and looking at displacement inside of Afghanistan, but also what the implications might be for the neighborhood. Two, looking at Europe and transit into Europe through Turkey, where a number of Afghans live and reside or try to seek safety. And then obviously the situation in Europe, where Afghans are the number, I think, two a group of asylum seekers in the European Union. And then three, looking at what the US role was in this in terms of dealing with the people who have come to the air bridge, but also SIV, resettlement, but more broadly, international leadership of what's to come in terms of the humanitarian effort. And I'm going to let Daphne and Yael talk about their respective areas of expertise. But in the region, for us, really, in addition to getting the architecture right in terms of having the president appoint a special envoy who can sort of really lead efforts on the US side, we also think that needs to happen on the UN side. There are a number of UN officials who are have regional or responsibility in the region and in Afghanistan, but we really feel someone who can lead this on the humanitarian front and with respect to the refugee crisis to come in the region would be quite important. In addition, the first order of business, we think, is really to see very, very deep engagement by the US government and then the UN and others with the regional countries, in particular Pakistan, to try to facilitate some sort of cross-border safe passage arrangements, right? Sometimes we call these humanitarian corridors, but we're not talking about arrangements where these things are protected by the military or UN peacekeepers. It's just the sense that if the Pakistanis and the US and the Taliban can come to an understanding about honoring the commitments that have been made around safe passage that are enshrined in last week's Security Council resolution, those things will go some steps to providing protection for those people who did not get out of Afghanistan vis-a-vis the air bridge, because our sense is that the air bridge really only dealt with just the tip of the iceberg in terms of displaced Afghans or Afghans at risk or trying to seek safety outside their borders. In addition to that, then, while we do believe that a lot of work is done with Pakistan and countries in the region to facilitate safe passage, the international donor community needs to step up and do a great deal to work with countries in the region to make sure that Pakistan and others have the resources they need at their disposal to welcome, right? And that what happens is now not just a question of providing safety for Afghans, but a win-win for host communities in the region who will be receiving these people. And we have best practices around that. And so I can go into more detail if that would be helpful. And in addition, we have some very clear recommendations for Turkey about what needs to be done to strengthen their ability to facilitate safe passage and provide some sort of asylum in that country. And then I'll turn this over now, I think probably first to Daphne to talk a bit about Europe, but then to Yael, who will talk a bit about on the US side, what needs to be done to really honor our commitments to those Afghan refugees who are being resettled and to SIVs. Daphne, over to you.
Thank you, Hardin, and hello to everyone. Thank you for joining this call. I'll speak just a little bit about the response from Europe, which has been quite discouraging in some ways. Like in the United States, the immediate priority was on evacuating people from Afghanistan, and certainly it's been important that they were able to evacuate more than 500 people, including 400 Afghans. But the focus of the response from EU leaders in rhetoric and in policy has largely been on, and I put this in quotes, protecting EU borders and preventing any large-scale arrival of asylum seekers and irregular migrants, like what was seen as a result of the Syrian civil war in 2015 and 2016. And what we want to remind and emphasize is that the so-called crisis in 2016 was a crisis of solidarity, and the EU can avoid this by taking concrete measures to properly share responsibility for asylum seekers that may come in, who may need to flee from Afghanistan, and to keep the borders open and welcome them and increase opportunities for resettlement and other pathways to arrive safely and legally in the EU for those who need protection. There have been barriers to accessing protection in the EU, which I go through in the report in some detail, from pushbacks and building walls at borders to policies of externalization to inconsistencies in asylum, in the way that the asylum protection decisions are issued. And so those need to be addressed. But really, while the focus on supporting countries in the region, neighboring countries in the region to host Afghans is important, and certainly realistically, that is where the majority of displaced Afghans have resided in the past and will likely continue to stay in as a result of this latest escalation in violence in the country. But that does not absolve the European Union from having to keep its own borders open and to facilitate pathways to protection for refugees who need to find protection in Europe as well. And so the report will go through those barriers, those obstacles to protection, and the response in more detail, and issue some recommendations for addressing them. And I can leave it there and pass it to Yael.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here. As Eric and Hardin mentioned, we started this report a while ago, and it's very obvious to me. One of my concerns was there was all this attention on SIVs, and getting people quickly processed and out of the country before the U.S. withdrawal. There wasn't much talk about anybody else. And as you all may know, we knew about the SIVs from long before, since many of them had been in the sort of application pipeline for a long time. So part of my interest in this report was looking at SIVs, but also looking at, some of the problems with that program. And then the other people who were not being looked at because we were focusing on that. The Biden administration has yesterday asked Congress for refugee support for those Afghans who have been paroled into the United States, and adjustment to permanent status, which is one of the things that we call for in our report. Parole is still a case-by-case kind of thing. It's not categorical. So the implication in the request by the Biden administration is that Department of Homeland Security intends to use parole through 2022. But not everyone will come in that way. So one of the things we suggest in the report are other ways we can use our refugee resettlement program, and in fact expand that refugee resettlement program and in different ways through new priorities for resettlement for folks who have who were not evacuated, who are still will be in third countries or even in Afghanistan itself. There are other ways to sort of get more people here through our refugee program, through our immigration program, through continued use of parole, as the administration is suggesting. And I think, part of our concern has also sort of the family unification piece. There are ways to do that and facilitate that through an expanded refugee resettlement program, through our immigration system, and through parole. And I just wanted to mention one other priority of ours is sort of this that Eric mentioned, is sort of how Afghan American organizations can sort of feed into the effort here in the United States. One of the things that the Biden administration called for yesterday was a provision that would enable the hiring of evacuated Afghans who had worked for who had been affiliated with the United States before they were evacuated, for the State Department to be able to hire them here in the United States. That's indicating to you that the Biden administration is keen on integrating and bringing Afghan Americans and Afghans into the effort of bringing their expertise to bear on how to get more folks out and how to do resettlement effectively. We do need, the way we set up the system is that the resettlement agencies who work here are going to be working with the government to sort of help Afghans integrate and resettle in the United States. And I think a key challenge, and something that we suggest in the report are ways that Afghan American organizations could really plug in. What we know is that there's a lot of support, a lot of money, a lot of stuff being raised by the Afghan American community to sort of help and welcome these new entrants, and how to actually plug them into the sort of public and organized effort for resettlement is one of the key suggestions we have in our report. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Yael. I also should, there were, as I say, there were other contributors to the report on the call, but I think at this point, maybe we'll just open it up for questions from the attendees. So any questions, please just feel free to chime in.
Hi there, this is Matt Smith. I'm from WISN TV in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm gonna ask kind of more of a specific question. Obviously, we have Fort McCoy here in Wisconsin. Curious if you have any broad concerns about what you're seeing at any of the military bases as all of this progresses, and if you're in communication with anyone working inside these bases right now, and if you have any specific communication with McCoy here in Wisconsin.
So I'm going to ask both Hardin and Yael to address that issue, and one or the other may be in a better position to do so.
Yeah, why don't you go first? Because I'm going to say something more broadly about the use of military bases.
Right. So I haven't been in touch with anybody in Wisconsin specifically. What I do know is, what I mean, if you, I can't tell from your question if your concern is about conditions there or what's actually happening in those bases. So, in terms of the screening and in terms of health screenings and in terms of casework that's being done there, and in terms of work authorization forms for Afghans coming in, I can sort of talk procedurally about what's happening. And that's, again, as Hardin sort of implied, happening at all the bases. One of the things that I have heard is that, there is some concern about, the adequacy of resettlement staff from the resettlement agencies being on the military bases. So more sort of, I guess, casework staff, welfare related staff, social work staff to be able to come on. And one of our suggestions is actually to have Afghan Americans who, can provide children and elderly people who may be there with the special services they need in language and culturally sensitive ways that might not be available. So those are some of the issues that I've heard around what's happening at the military bases. So far as I understand, it's a rather brief stay for most people, and conditions are okay. But maybe Hardin can speak a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Yael. No, I was just going to add less about the bases in the United States, but more broadly, what are referred to often as the lily pads, which are the military bases in the region, right, or in Europe, where people were evacuated, or Afghans were evacuated out of Kabul too. So, for example, in Al Udeid, you probably have seen there's been a fair amount of reporting around the conditions on those bases for people who are being processed, often to prepare them for parole into the United States. And in many places, I have been talking to some Afghans and talking to some people who are working on the base. And the conditions, at least in the beginning, were not good in terms of like the overcrowding, the lack of humanitarian assistance being available, people just getting basic, like the kind of conditions in which people would usually be housed. I mean, those facilities were not set up to do that. And they got a number of people very, very fast. And the US military did the very best they could with what they had. We are now beginning to see some efforts sort of backfill that, right? Some efforts of NGOs and others who do have access to some of those bases, providing some baseline humanitarian assistance that I think will really sort of begin to help with that. But hopefully, again, these won't be a long-term presence. We'll be able to get these people into the United States or to other countries where they can receive sort of a more sort of permanent, or at least a longer-term set of assistance and services.
One other thing I just wanted to mention really quick is that there was some concern because families may have been separated in the initial evacuation and may arrive on different flights, or may be separated upon arrival and sent to different military bases. So one of the big requests by the refugee resettlement agencies and advocates is to make sure that if that happens, the government is keeping good track of where different family members are being sent, so that doesn't lead to some sort of separation or people moving after being sort of resettled in different parts of the country and then having to move and losing access to benefits and things like that. So just a tracking of family members who may not be traveling together and may end up at different military bases.
Can I just add something really quickly? I tend to work on the international end of things, but I did used to work in resettlement. So I do want to emphasize that the people coming are likely going to need, Yael mentioned access to social services, including mental health. Many have been through a serious trauma. And so I think the investment now needs to be made to recognize that people are going to need access to counselors and therapists and anything that you can imagine you would need after going through a trauma like this and being uprooted and suddenly in another country on a military base trying to figure it out. So that's a much longer term haul, and they certainly will be ready to be, you know, active members of society, but some of the investment needs to be made up front. So I thought I would add that. Thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Other questions?
Hi, this is Steph Kite with Axios. Thank you all for having the call. I was just wondering if you could speak to some of the challenges with providing services and benefits to Afghans who are being brought to the US under parole. Like, can more be done? I don't know, like I know that they don't have the same access as resettled refugees. So just curious if you could speak to that.
Oh, why don't I start and then I'll turn to colleagues who might want to add. But I suppose as the former head of the refugee program, it's probably I can probably say a few words about the U.S. refugee program. I can probably say a few words about this. Right now, the resettlement agencies have been the voluntary resettlement agencies, of which there are 8 or 9 national agencies, all of which have local affiliates. They've been asked to help by the federal government, and but there's no obvious source of money to help assist the parolees who are coming in, because parole doesn't come with any benefits. So the administration at this point is using an extraordinary measure, which is they're taking funds from the Emergency Refugee and Migration Assistance Account, which is a very flexible account, otherwise known as IRMA, to make available as much as hundreds of millions of dollars to help support the resettlement agencies, who will be in turn supporting the Afghans who will be in communities. But the administration, yes, and that's a good thing. That's what they have at their disposal, the administration. But the administration yesterday requested of Congress, number one, a whole lot more money, which is a good thing, and a process for adjustment of status from the status of parolee to ultimately the status of legal permanent resident. And we are generally supportive. I mean, frankly, the report kind of made those recommendations. So we had a little bit of rewriting to do last night before we released the report. But by and large, I think, and Yael can echo this or question it. I think in general, we feel like the administration is sort of on the right track. I had the opportunity to meet the former governor of Delaware, who has been asked to be the U.S. resettlement coordinator, also a role that we were urging the administration to adopt. And I think they're working very hard. And I think the critical component here will be the reaction of Congress to support what the administration is trying to do. But let me turn to my colleagues and see whether they have anything to add to that.
Just that, just so that it's clear, refugees are entitled to certain benefits from the time they arrive in the United States. First, for some assistance directly from the federal government, and then through ORR and also through the states, they're eligible for certain social welfare benefits that legal permanent residents are not. And one of the issues is that even if the parolees were given the ability to adjust to permanent residence, they would still also need to be authorized to receive the same benefits that refugees are allowed to receive. And so that's why, just to explain that what the Biden administration is suggesting is not only the ability to adjust to permanent status, which is legal permanent resident status, but also this added eligibility for those refugee benefits. And that, again, as Eric said, the administration, without any much additional funding, can provide short-term grants to resettlement agencies for just a little bit of assistance. That money is already available. But for these refugee benefits, what is really required is appropriation of additional funds to cover this, and that authority to provide people paroled and who may adjust to permanent status those added refugee benefits.
Look, if you're not an expert on this, the simplest way to look at this is the administration is trying, and I think we're supportive of creating a system that essentially treats these Afghans the way other resettled refugees would be treated. No special treatment, but because they came in the way they did, they got to have some legislative provisions, but really to treat them the way other refugees come in, whether they're from the Congo or from Myanmar or anywhere else in the world.
And to be clear, the United States did that for other people who came in, like when the Vietnamese came into the United States, we did the same. The United States did the same thing as did for Cubans as well. And so, in other words, people who came in as parolees and then were provided these benefits. So this is not something that has not been done before, even for people who came in this status.
Okay. If I could quickly follow up. That was really helpful. Thank you, both of you, for that. So if Congress does not pass what the administration has asked for, is the only option for parolees to go through the asylum process, or what's the ideal situation there?
I would encourage you to read the report because there's an extensive discussion of that. The administration has a lot of options, and I will turn to Yael, but we don't have to go into great detail. The short of it is, they could. We think they could make use of the Refugee Act and treat these people as refugees, not go through refugee processing. They also have access to the asylum system. And the administration does have continual capacity to provide emergency funding. So the administration is not without options, but it will be a more difficult situation. Yael, is there anything
Yeah. I mean, just to reiterate, the issue is not, can the Afghans use the asylum system? They absolutely can. The question is, and SIV system, the question is what, in terms of resources, would that make sense? And in terms of, what would do the job quickest, most efficiently? And again, the refugee processing option that Eric mentioned might be a better bet given the sort of other constraints that the asylum system is under right now. So anyway, but certainly congressional action, first of all, is the sort of historic norm in cases like this. I wanted to make that emphasis. This is what Congress has done in the past. So hopefully Congress can do it again. But again, we outline other options if that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and again, I'm going to say one more thing, and then I want to make a point and also invite Horton to talk about it in a second, but just to say, for those who are not experts on the asylum and refugee system, and some of you may not be, we have the Refugee Act, which resettles refugees from overseas. We have an asylum system, which people who are here can access. That's two. And also, a lot of these people have certain potential entitlements, whether they're special immigrant visas or other visas. So the short of it is, without special legislation, they can access many of these. But I want to make sure we don't miss the forest for the trees in this press conference, because much of what we're talking about is heavily discussed and debated. Certainly in our report, it's heavily discussed. Certainly, it's heavily discussed among other organizations. That's where the focus is right now. But the bulk of this report is really what's happening in the region. And our fear institutionally is that's the issue that, in some sense, right now is the most compelling one, because the Afghans who have fled, by and large, are now in safety. But so this call for a special presidential envoy for the region. And the report's focus on engagement, on continued engagement, is really a sort of a key takeaway in this report. And because the report is comprehensive, it deals with resettlement as well. But the issue that we're concerned about, I think, is this engagement, beyond our borders and in the region. So I'm going to invite Hardin, if you want to say a few words about that. I think that would be, very, 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 very useful, because the first recommendation of this report is a special presidential envoy.
Sure, and I think the danger we're concerned about, as Eric just said, is that now that the airlift is over, most of the attention will simply shift to what is happening inside of the United States, which rightly there needs to be a tremendous amount of attention on how we're dealing with the people who are being paroled and the people, who the airlift managed to get out. But again, UNHCR, if you look what's happening inside of Afghanistan right now, right? So over half the population requires, or at least roughly half the population requires, humanitarian assistance. A third of it needs urgent food assistance, right? Meaning they're in a situation of very deep food insecurity. Drought is a significant problem. COVID-19 pandemic is ravaging the healthcare system, or what remains the healthcare system inside of Afghanistan. Obviously, much of the population, especially the female population, deeply concerned about their rights moving forward under a Taliban regime. Far from clear the Taliban are actually going to be able to fully consolidate control over the majority, over the country, at least the way they look to it right now, but we'll see how that plays out in the coming months, given they only have 75,000 men under arms. Now, you combine all of that, right? And you can see, and the fact that right now, much of the UN system had to pull out, and one of the 8 organizations had to pull out as the Taliban advanced. They're now beginning to sort of re-enter, and some actually remained and continued. But doing business and providing humanitarian assistance under the Taliban is a deeply challenging endeavor, one that we will get there, hopefully, but there's clearly been some hiccups in the system as the Taliban have taken over the country. So take all that, and then the sort of external pressures, right, or the internal pressures for people to cross borders and leave, I think are quite significant and high. And then if you look at what's going on, if you look at UNHCR's estimates, the High Commissioner for Refugees' estimates of up to 500,000 Afghans potentially leaving by the end of the year, and Pakistan saying it could be as high as 700,000, and then look at what's happening in the surrounding countries, both in Iran, in Pakistan, and the northern neighbors, those borders are largely officially closed, right? So what you're going to have is this deep outward pressure for people trying to get out, but if there's no release valve, there's no way for them to make their way across borders, those people are going to be trapped inside a situation where they're going to be dependent on a humanitarian lifeline from the international community that at the moment is going to be quite challenging to execute because of the security situation and because of dealing with the Taliban inside of Afghanistan. And that is a recipe for this turning into what is already a humanitarian crisis, turning into a humanitarian catastrophe at a regional level. And so for us, the measures that we're talking about and where we really want to see the US government, the Secretary General and others deeply engage is trying to get this right, trying to work on getting assistance into the country, but also begin the process of establishing the architecture at the regional level that will allow Afghans to move outside their borders when and if that becomes necessary.
Thank you, Hardin. Any more questions?
Hi, this is Priscilla Alvarez from CNN. What challenges do you foresee in the month of September as we expect the arrival of tens of thousands of evacuees and a resettlement infrastructure that has just been decimated over the last 4 years?
I don't want to underestimate those challenges. They're significant and substantial. But I would make a couple of points that I think mitigate those concerns. Don't eliminate them, but mitigate them. The first is you still have an enormous capacity in the U.S. resettlement network, and especially with an infusion of funds, as the administration has indicated is prepared to do. And my second point, which is I think the more significant point, is that our experience is that that people do well. People who have to, as long as they have sufficient resources, they have enough resources so they don't have to, in the first months of their arrival, choose between buying diapers for their kids or putting food on the table. As long as they have sufficient resources, people do okay. Especially refugees who have endured a whole heck of a lot to get here. And in addition, I think they have support networks now in the Afghan American community, which are already being brought to bear. So I think the challenges will be significant, no question. But I think this is an issue. This is a challenge that I believe of all the challenges we face, I think this one, as important and significant as it is, I think will be effectively managed. But Yael, you may have other views, you may have differing views. Well, she hasn't put her camera on, so maybe she doesn't. There she is. Yeah? No, she's frozen. All right, we'll give her another couple of seconds. And Yael, if you come back on and you can speak, just interrupt at any time. Okay. Any other members of the team whose microphones are working would care to comment on this particular question? Okay. I'm sorry?
This is Sarah. Sorry, I was trying to conserve bandwidth. Yeah, just again, kind of speaking from the resettlement experience, I think and Eric knows this really well, is that amidst maybe initial challenges with, levels of integration, right? Learning a language, learning how to live here in the US, most studies have shown that over long periods of time, refugees become very productive members of society, have the capacity to contribute a lot to the society. So I think I'm always cautious about focusing on, all of the challenges, which of course are great, right? Anytime you're starting a new life in a new country, the challenges are great, but there's also a lot of capacity for contribution to society as well. So I think we need to underscore that as well.
Now your mic is off, Yael.
Can you hear me?
Now we can. Please.
Okay, sorry. I just want to say, okay, one of the major challenges is we're in housing. Let's just be frank. There's a housing crunch right now, and it's one of the main things I've been hearing from resettlement agencies and concerns from them. And I think that one of the key things that needs to happen and is already starting to happen, for example, is that the resettlement agencies are working really, really hard to channel what has been an immense, and if you ask any of the heads of the resettlement agencies about this, an immense upswing of support, almost unprecedented in terms of how many people are calling to volunteer and to donate. And so I think there's a lot of interest in donating and contributing and helping out. And so I think the key thing now is actually more logistical, like making sure that the landlords who have the apartments or, who are willing to give space can be channeled in the right direction. So actually what needs to happen is effective coordinating of the immense amount of support, volunteerism and support that has kind of been charged, from corporations. If you've read the stories, lots of corporations are chipping in and wanting to help. So there's a lot of energy of people wanting to help. And I think what needs to happen is a lot of that needs to be directed in the right way. So, you might have 10 couches, but couches might not be what's needed for the Afghans, right? So part of it is just coordinating. And I agree with Sarah and with Eric about the resiliency. The refugee resettlement agencies have been wanting to get back into this business. They've been for 4 years, they've been wanting to get back started. So the energy is really there. And now it's just a coordination issue.
I think we have time probably for one more question, and then I think we'll close the briefing. Well, it's always good when you have time for one more question and you're done. So listen, thank you so much. And feel free to be in touch with any of the participants in this briefing offline. And we're all accessible through our website, our email addresses. So please feel free to be in touch. thank you very much for taking the time, and we'll look forward to staying connected. Take care.